Hello and welcome back. I'm Nicole, a cottage witch, and today I'm doing my book wrap up for April, or at least part of April, because I read a ridiculous number of books this month, most of them audiobooks, although I have a lot of the physical copies in my apartment because of course I do. But I think in this video I think I'll focus on the classics that I've read because I've been in a classics reading sort of groove, and then in the next video I'll talk about all the other non-classics books I read. So first of all, I finished finally this series, whoops, as I knocked my camera stand, In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. It's long, it's really long. He talks a lot. He does go on. So I started reading this. How many books are there? 6. 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, I can't remember, something like that. And for a while I read one every spring, and it was just sort of the spring book to read. And then last summer I didn't, and I can't remember if I did the spring before that. Can't remember if I did the spring before that. But this spring I started The Captive and then just kept going and finished the series, which is good. So now that I've read the whole series, what do I think of the series? It's long. It's really freaking long. So the first book is amazing. The first book has the classic Madeline memory scene that if you've heard of this book, you've probably heard of that scene. Or if you've heard of anything to do with this book, it would probably be that. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful book. There's nothing by way of plot in this book. Nothing happens. I mean, things happen, but they don't really. Like, people go for walks, people go to balls, people go visit each other at each other's houses. That's kind of it. There's not much else in the way of plot. So that's the first book, is mostly walking along the paths, remembering things, which is really interesting, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's hard to know because of translations, because I haven't read it in French. And we'll get to my French studying books later, but I'm not really good enough to read this in French. And I certainly wasn't even close when I started this series in English. So English it is. But with translations, it's funny because you never really know if you're getting like the soul of a story, or if you're just getting sort of the literal, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. Now these translations, I've partly read and partly listened to audiobooks, which I'll link an audiobook below that I've listened to. Both seem very good. Like, I'm not saying they're bad translations or anything like that. They both seem very good, but you still never quite know what you're getting. So it seems like in the first book, the language is very beautiful. I really enjoyed that one. The next books, 2 through 4, really, well, 3, are kind of boring. If nothing happens in the first book, even fewer things happen in those books. I mean, he has a girlfriend, sorta, ish. He talks about her a lot. He breaks up with her and then ends up with a different girlfriend. Like, it's just, and the way he goes on about women is maddening. Now, there are some things in Sodom and Gomorrah that are interesting, because that's a book that does deal with both homosexuality and lesbianism. And lesbianism does feature in this book quite a lot as well, The Captive and The Fugitive, because the main character is probably bisexual, and then some of the other characters are gay as well. So there's some interesting things about that, you know, for the time period, fairly advanced probably, and more interesting. And the way his mind works, he does have interesting conversations sort of with himself in the book. Like, most of this book is the narrator's thoughts about just life and things. So it is interesting. I'm glad I read it. I would never read the books 2 through 4 again because they're boring as all get out. This book got more interesting. Okay, so The Captive is the second girlfriend, Albertine. She basically is his captive. The narrator is very jealous. He doesn't treat women particularly well at all. He wants to possess her. He doesn't really want what we'd consider now to be a healthy relationship. He wants to own her. And once he has her in his possession, he controls what she does. He's very controlling. But then also once he has her, he stops caring that he has her. Like, he stops caring about her as much. Not that he ever cared about her so much as about just possessing her, but so that was, I mean, it was a good book, The Captive, but it was maddening because I wanted to slap the narrator the whole time. Like, he's just kind of a jerk. So The Fugitive is when she leaves, which he kind of knew was going to happen because he was a jerk, and why would you stay? Even if he was paying for her stuff, no, like, that was never gonna work. And this one actually gets much more interesting because it's all his thoughts about realizing how he treated her, and about his jealousy, and about how he didn't appreciate her once he sort of quote-unquote had her. All that sort of thing. There's a lot of discussion, spoiler alert. She dies in a car accident, or a car carriage, I don't know, horse and buggy situation, whatever. Anyway, then there's a lot of conversation about death and more about memory, and it's very interesting. And then that sort of carries on into Time Regained, and this talks even more about death and memory and relationships, and it also veers into the First World War, which obviously death everywhere and horrifying death, and it really changed a lot of people's lives dramatically, changed the country dramatically. There's a German character that he talks about who he's related to, so one of the things that I distinctly remember was about how his German relative was now like the enemy or something. It's just also, war is so messed up. But yeah, it's this, honestly, this book and the first book are by far the two best books in this entire series, volume. I don't know how you consider this book, if it's all like one book in different volumes, if it's a series of 6 or 7 books, depending on how it's printed. Anyway, it's massive. I'm finally finished, and I'm glad I read it. If my French ever gets good enough, I may read parts of the first or the last volume again, but those would probably be the only books I'd ever read again. But yeah, it was an interesting experience, and now I can say I've read Proust, and yeah, so that's fun. What is my computer doing? It's having a moment. Okay, next on my list, I listened to. So I had this book on my shelf for, I don't know, like over a decade, and never read it. I like these little thrift editions because they're so little and so cheap, and they fit nicely on my shelf and don't cost much money at all. Anyway, beside the point. The point is, I'm reading Ulysses. This is actually the point, and tangents is sort of a thing with Ulysses, so bear with me. Ulysses has a lot of references to just everything, including a lot of Western literature, like a lot, and Blake is one of them. So I'm listening to a podcast called Rejoice, Exploring the World of Ulysses with Frank Delaney. I'll link it down below. It is phenomenal. Even if you're not interested in Ulysses, if you've ever been like passingly curious about Ulysses, just listen to the first few episodes of Rejoice. He's so enthusiastic about it. You can't help being a little interested. And it's really fun, and he goes through like sentence by sentence. It took him years to do this podcast. Like, I can't remember how many years, but many. And basically goes through it line by line, talking about all of the references that he can pull out. And okay. I was going to talk about this later, but we'll talk about it now. I'm this far in. So this is how far I am in the podcast, and this is how far. So once I read a certain chapter or section, listen to the podcast for that section. I have an audiobook, and I'll read and listen to it together again. So that's what I've been doing, which I've been really enjoying. And I've read it before. I wrote down the time and the character from Greek mythology that it's associated with. because each chapter is I lost the ability to speak just then, is associated with a certain character in Greek mythology. So first one is Telemachus. I think the second one is Nestor, and so on. And somebody has figured out what times everything is at, so I wrote that down too. Anyway, it's a beautiful book. Like, the first time I read it, I didn't love it, but I could recognize that it was a beautifully musical book. The language is very musical, which is why I'm listening to it and reading it at the same time, because I just listened to it last time, and so I really wanted to actually have it in my hands this time. But yeah, it's fascinating. And this is the second time I've been through this podcast. I think I didn't listen to the last 2 seasons or something last time because it was taking too long and I'd gotten to the end already, so whatever. But I'm back at it again this time. And yeah, it's phenomenal. The book is incredible. Like, his choice of language is just astonishing, and the range of his reading is incredible. And so the podcast is very helpful because, I mean, there's a lot of Western literature I haven't read yet, but also there's a lot of Irish history I'm not familiar with. A lot of well, there's a lot of classical mythology. I'm a bit more familiar with that. A lot of religion, both Judaism and Catholicism, and I grew up Protestant, so I mean, I'm not now, but I grew up in that sort of milieu. So a lot of the references I get, but not all of them. Like, I don't have the experience of going to a Jesuit school and that sort of thing. And Frank Delaney does, like the guy who does the podcast. So he can sort of explain some of these experiences that, as a non-Irish, non-Catholic person, I don't have. But it's fascinating. It's so, yeah. The podcast is phenomenal. The book I'm really enjoying so far. Took me on a bit of a tangent there, but yeah, so basically I read this because it was mentioned in here, or referenced. Then, sticking with modernist literature theme for a bit, I read The Master and Margarita, which has also been on my shelf for a while, and I keep hearing people talk about it, and they love it. And did I love it? Not really. I liked it. It was fun and funny and weird and a bit twisted. And very, I don't know, abstract, I guess. Like, there is a plot in this one, but at the same time, there's so much weird that trying to pin things down is a bit difficult, which is, I think, probably at least part of the point. Yeah, that was fun to read. Not sure I'll read it again. Not sure I'll even keep it, but I'm glad I read it, so at least I know what's going on when people talk about this book. Also, one of the other books I'll get to in a second that I'm currently reading is Faust, which does tie in with the Woland character in this. So all of these, like, Western literature, I mean, I suppose literature in other countries does this too. It references itself a lot, like people reference each other's books as they're writing. So it is kind of interesting to have more of that, you know, knowledge at your fingertips as you're reading. Another modernist book I read from Iran this time is Blind Owl. This one I did love. I have even less an idea what happened in this book, but I loved the language and the descriptions of things, and it was a bit darker, bit gorier, sometimes a bit like you weren't sure if it was going to be a bit creepy, what the heck was going on. Dreamlike recollections fueled by opium and alcohol. Yeah, I mean, that kind of describes what happened in this book. So, you know, if you're trying to find a through line, there might be one. I don't know what it is. But it's I think, for a book like this, for me anyway, it's more about the experience of reading it rather than knowing what the book is actually about. And so I now have had the experience of reading this book and feeling what I felt while reading it and enjoying the language and everything. I still couldn't tell you what it was about. So there's that. Okay, so I kept going with some classics. I read, excuse me, Middlemarch, which I'd started back in January, maybe? I don't know. I've talked about it before. Because I read The Mill on the Floss and I really enjoyed that one. And so I wanted to read more George Eliot. I think I have one more book by her, Andrew Bede maybe? I can't remember. Anyway, I started reading it. I liked it, but I wasn't in the mood for it, so I put it down and didn't finish it at that point. So I picked it up again this month, and yeah, I really like it. The characters are just sort of ordinary but interesting people. There's a whole, I guess, cross-section of society in, is it Victorian? Yeah, provincial Victorian. Okay, it seemed Victorian. And it's kind of, you know, classically Victorian England. Like, it's very ordinary, which I don't mean as a bad thing. It's just, it's not modernist in any way. Like, after reading some of these other books, it makes you think about some of the relationships between people, the relationships people have with money in particular, and in relationships where they may or may not actually care about their partner. So yeah, like, it comments on those, but it's more just doing that via a straight up ordinary story about the English countryside. Which is why I kind of had to be in the mood for it, because sometimes I just don't feel like reading that, and then sometimes I do. So, you know, I really enjoyed it. I don't know what else to say about it. Some of the characters are really interesting. Some of them I didn't like. Some of them, which I guess is a thing people do, like, you get yourself into predicaments that you then have to get yourself out of, and you're like, why did I even? Like, after the fact, you can look at it and go, how did I even get myself into that mess? And so, reading about some of these characters, you could kind of look at them from the outside and go, come on, buddy, get it together. But when they're in it, you know, just living their life day to day, they can't, you know, you don't have that perspective. So, that was kind of interesting. And then I read these two. So I read Turn of the Screw. Well, I listened to it actually as an audiobook, but both of these, yeah. So the Turn of the Screw I'd read so many years ago, just out of university, because I ASM'd the opera The Turn of the Screw out at the Banff Center, and that was a heck of an experience. And I couldn't say I really loved the opera. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. Britain is not the composer for me, I think. But yeah, but for a lot of operas, if they're based off books, I've read the book when I've worked on the opera. So I read, you know, the Lady of the Camellias for Traviata and things like that. Carmen for Carmen. If you've ever read the short story of Carmen, you really want to punch that guy in the face, because everything is Carmen's fault. He cannot take responsibility for his actions. It's worse than the opera. In that regard, where if you're a woman, you just kind of want to sock him in the face, because get it together, buddy. Take some responsibility for your own life choices. Anyway, it's all about the tangents in this video. It's very in keeping with this whole Ulysses modernist situation. Anyway, Turn of the Screw. I didn't like the short story then. I appreciate it better now, I think, but I still don't love it. It's been compared to, like, I think it's inspired by Jane Eyre a little bit, but Jane Eyre is so much better. I like it so much better. The governess in this one is, you kind of can't tell if she's actually lost her marbles or not, or if she's actually seeing ghosts, which is probably the more interesting part of the novel, because really you can't tell for sure. I mean, people will have their opinions about it, but I don't think there's enough evidence in the book to say with certainty one or the other. So that's kind of the most interesting part, psychologically. But most of the characters I didn't find terribly well developed. Especially the kids. The kids were boring and just barely, like, human. It was strange. So yeah, still not sure that this is a favorite or anything, but it was interesting. I read it partly because, and I'll talk about this in my other books video, I read Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azar Nafisi, who is an English teacher. She works, I think, in DC these days, but she taught in Tehran for a long time, English literature. And Henry James is one of her favorite authors, and I don't think he's one of my favorite authors, although I do love the book. But you know, sometimes when somebody talks about an author they love, you're like, okay, that sounds kind of interesting, I'll try it. Yeah, I'm not convinced. So I don't know if I'll read. I think I have the audiobook for A Portrait of a Lady, but I don't know if I'll read it. We'll see, maybe. Then I read Death in Venice. This also has an opera based on it, which I've never seen. And I'd never read Thomas Mann before, and this was really interesting. It's a strange one, but you really get into this guy's head. Like, I don't know why I'm thinking of Crime and Punishment right now, but it's a little bit like that, where somebody has their own psychological issues and you really just get inside their head the whole time. The death is not a murder in this one. It's not about somebody who killed anybody. That's not why the Crime and Punishment connection. It's just that you spend the whole time basically inside his head, viewing his summer vacation in Venice through his eyes, and dealing with the emotional things to do with mostly aging and relevance that he's dealing with. Yeah, it was really interesting. I think one day I will read, I don't know, I'm reading Faust right now by, what's his name? Goethe. My German pronunciation is no good. Apologies. But I might read either Dr. Faustus or The Magic Mountain. I think there's an audiobook for The Magic Mountain. I might read, so I might listen to that. I don't know. But I'm intrigued enough by this story to want to read more of this author. So there's that. And then, okay, I had to move that pile out of the way because it's getting ridiculous on my desk. I have these little books. They're these Penguin, what are they called? Little Black Classics. You get them for like $5 Canadian, which is like $3 American. I don't know. They're cheap. Some of them on Amazon now are expensive. Don't spend $200 on these. They're all open source. Guys, no, not necessary. But years ago, the bookstore near me had a whole ton of these, and I should have gotten some more, and I didn't. So I got these ones because I thought, oh, I'll try them. They'll be fun and easy, and maybe I'll go back for some more. And then they were on my shelf for years collecting dust, and now I don't know if you can buy them anymore. But anyway, the point is, I finally got to them. So I'd never even heard of Leonid Andreev, but he wrote this book, little novella called Seven Hanged. And so there's a coup attempt that's sort of inspired by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand that started World War I. And so it's partly inspired by the trial and execution of people who were involved in that. But then there were two other prisoners who were just arrested for other things, non-political things, one a murder and one, I can't remember actually what the other guy did. Anyway, it's very strange. It's very Russian. It's so Russian. It's very dark. I don't know that I'd quite call it heart-stopping. Visceral? Yeah, maybe. Heart-stopping might be a bit of a stretch, at least by modern standards. But, I mean, basically you just spend time in this prison with these guys getting into their heads. And sometimes what led them to the place they got to, but mostly it's just about what goes through people's heads when they're in jail and are about to be executed, which is a whole interesting psychological adventure that is very different for each of the people. So yeah, it was pretty interesting to read. It's, it's not a cheerful book. It's very, you have to be in a sort of mood to read it, but yeah, it's interesting. Then I read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and I tell you, these Russian authors, Russian literature is special. I think Viv Gross-Pep, what's her name? There's a book about Russian literature that I want to read one day, but it's its own special subcategory within European literature. It's death is a theme. Cold, dark, winter, it's a thing. Anyway, this was interesting. It's also, you get into the head of somebody. Did I read 3 deaths? I may have missed that at the end, because I can't remember that one. But the death of Ivan Illich is a guy who gets sick. Nobody can diagnose him. He knows he's gonna die, and it's sort of his experience of, you know, the 7 stages of grief or whatever when it comes to accepting or not accepting your own death. That's, in his case, impending, like, pretty rapidly. He's, you know, not a very likable character, but he's an interesting one. And it is interesting. It's again, it's one of these Russian books that you have to be in the right frame of mind for, or just in a mood for that sort of literature, because it is a bit, not morbid, kind of morbid. But yeah, it's about psychologically one guy dealing with what he, you know, reflecting on his life. Was it successful or not? How does he feel about it now? How did he feel about it yesterday before he knew he was going to die? You know, that sort of thing. Then Dostoevsky's White Nights. These are all Russian. The next ones are, well, Russian. More Russian and then English. Is Chekhov Russian? I can't remember. I'll Google him. Anyway, this is Russian. There's 2 stories in here, I think. White Nights and Bokok. They're very good. White Nights in particular was one of these, like, chance encounter. It's just a sort of vignette of a chance encounter with another person. This guy thinks he falls in love. I mean, I say he thinks because he doesn't really know this woman. And she's engaged to somebody else, which you knew at the beginning. She was waiting for her fiance. I can't remember what city. Petersburg, maybe. Anyway, it's really interesting. It's a sentimental love story. Yeah, kinda. I mean, I'm not sure he really loves her. That might be a bit of a stretch. She is in love with her fiance. That's pretty clear. But she's worried that he isn't going to show up. So it's just sort of their conversations over a couple of evenings of her trying to track down her fiance, who is supposed to have arrived in the city by then, obviously pre-cell phones. So yeah, I'm not sure I have much else to say about it other than that. It's pretty good. Okay, A Nervous Breakdown. This, I think, is like 3 stories or something. How many? Yeah, The Black Monk. That was, I think, my favorite. And Anna Around the Neck. Anna Around the Neck is weird. It's just weird. I'm not really sure what to make of that one. Actually, okay. I just had to confirm that, yes, Chekhov is Russian. I don't know why I just blanked on that. Anyway, I'd read some plays of his in university when I was doing my undergrad. But I'd never read any of his short stories, I don't think. But I might read some more, because A Nervous Breakdown was good. A bit weird, but good. But The Black Monk was really good. Like, this guy basically starts hallucinating a black monk, or a monk all dressed in black, not a black person who's a monk, I don't think, and talking to him. And I think I'm not sure, I can't remember right at the beginning if he knows it's a hallucination, but eventually he does know it's a hallucination. He knows it's not real, but he keeps it a secret. And then eventually he gets married, and his wife wakes up one night to hear him talking to somebody who's not there, and freaks out, as you may well do. And so he's committed to an asylum and goes through this whole process of being treated for this illness, which he allegedly recovers from. But the process of recovery actually makes his life so much worse than it was when he was hallucinating a monk, who was just somebody he could talk to about whatever ideas were floating around in his head. So it's really interesting. I'm not sure what the author's, opinions were on this, on mental illness or whatever, but it's a really interesting take on, how you interact with your own mind, and what the experience of curing you might do to you if it changes your perception of yourself in a really like fundamental way. So that was really good. May have to read more of his short stories. And then I read Orinoco by Afra Ben. This is one of the contenders. I think she has a couple other novels that are contenders for like the first novel written in English. She wrote them, I think, in letter styles, like dear, whatever, so and so. But this story was, okay, first of all, she had a weird life. She was a spy. She, as a woman in the 1600s, was traveling to Africa and other places in Europe, and yeah, bizarre woman. Very cool story, as much as is known, which is a bit debatable. And it's not clear if this was based on any kind of true story. It potentially is. I think it's set in Senegal, or at least it starts out set in Senegal. Of course, the borders in the 1600s and now are completely different, so who knows exactly. But basically, this man who was some sort of prince in Senegal is sold by his father. So his father kidnaps his, I don't know if it's his wife or his lover or whatever. Anyway, his father kidnaps her to take as his own wife, which is weird enough. And then there's a whole lot of family drama, and they end up both being sold into slavery. And I think they stay in Africa. They just go to somewhere else in Africa. I wasn't entirely the way she talks about like natives. I wasn't sure if she was talking about people in North America or people in Africa. I think Africa, but because I think it was another colony in Africa that they went to, but I wasn't 100% clear on that one. Anyway, it's the experience of these two being separated, meeting again as slaves, and what their experiences of slavery was like. It's a really interesting book. It's one of the first, well, probably the first ever book written about somebody who was enslaved in a compassionate, viewing them as a human being sort of way. So in that way, I mean, in a lot of ways, this woman was well ahead of her time. It would have been interesting to see what she'd do these days, because she just broke all the rules for her own time. Yeah, and this has been on my list because it's, you know, one of the first novels in English. It was on my list for a good long while. Okay, those are the books I've finished that fall into the classics category. There are a few others. Oh, this tower of books is going to fall over. 1 second. Okay, that I'm reading currently, and then a couple others that I will get to at some point. So, in progress. We talked about Ulysses already, so I won't rehash that. But I'm also listening to, well, I'm listening to Faust. Did I mention that? I think I mentioned that. I can't keep track anymore. But I haven't finished it yet, so I'll probably finish it next month. Because I'm actually listening to it as an audiobook. But I think the audiobook that comes in Audible, like as just part of your library, is just part 1, and there's a part 2, and then the unpublished scenarios with the witches, which I really want to read. So we'll see. I'll get to that. And then, is this a classic? I guess it qualifies as a classic of fantasy now. I've been reading Le Seigneur des Anneaux, the Lord of the Rings. So I'm yay far through it. But I've been mostly listening to the audiobook. So I started reading it as a physical book. Then I was too slow to put up with myself. So I started listening to the audiobook. Unfortunately, they've used a different translation for the audiobook than for this printed copy, which drives me nuts. I wish publishers wouldn't do that, but what can you do? I'm not in charge, clearly. But then I read a couple chapters, and then I went back to the audiobook. So I've been sort of switching back and forth depending on my mood, frankly. And then this one I can read with the audiobook. So Madame Bovary was another book that was mentioned by Azar Nafisi in Reading Lolita in Tehran. And it's been on my shelf for a million years, and I've never gotten to it, partly because it's in French, and my French is not good enough. I mean, it's still not good enough, but I'm reading it anyway. What the heck? So But because it's originally in French, the upside is the audiobook and the text match, thankfully. So I'm listening to it and reading it simultaneously, which is a really interesting way to learn languages. A lot of people will swear by that method, so that's what I've been doing. And I've gotten the gist of the plot. Some interesting things about the characters and descriptions of the place and things. I can get, some of it goes over my head, which I know, but oh well. It's still a fun process to read it. Also, I really like this picture by Manet on the front. It's good. What's it called? Berthe Morisot, Au Bouquet de Violettes. Don't see the violette. Oh, maybe, they're cut off. Okay. Anyway, it's all about the tangents in this one. And then I got Wrapup, the Assamil book. So partly this is to learn French and partly this is to learn Arabic, because it's for learning Arabic for French speakers. So what I'm doing is, I'm not doing all of them. I don't do all the exercises because they're boring, frankly. But I'll try and read what I can. And when I don't understand something, I'll go over here to the French to figure out what it is. Because this French is easy enough that I'm like, yeah, okay, this is fine. I can comprehend the French text in this book because it's trying to be simple enough. So that's fine. And then it's just the Arabic that's the challenge. It's a heck of a challenge though. But so a lot of the words I knew already, but some of them I didn't. And some of them are really confusing, like when they don't write the vowels in, but the vowels change the meaning of a word that would otherwise look the same. Yeah, that's fun. Not sure who came up with that brilliant plan, but I'd like a word. Anyway, it's fun. It's one of these like sort of, it's not quite two-facing, but like this is the same, you know. I don't really know how to explain it, but yeah, this sentence is that sentence. And then it has notes about, and so sometimes I'll read through the notes just out of curiosity because it'll have interesting things about grammar or spelling or whatever. I don't read them all because sometimes they're boring, and mostly I'm just in it for the text, and then I'll try and read the little sentences and see what I can get, which I'm actually doing not bad at so far, but I'm only on lesson 8, so it's all very easy so far. So anyway. One day I'll feel like I'm actually making progress in Arabic. I have not gotten there yet. Progress has not been made. I mean, it probably has been, but it sure doesn't feel like it. And then the last things I'll talk about are, excuse me, the next classics I'm going to read, which are this beast, which is actually a bilingual version if you want to learn Italian, which I don't particularly, but cool. It's got some cool images in it, and other bits. But yeah, I sort of always wanted to know about the Inferno because it's referenced in so much other literature. Like, you just know about it. Also, it's referenced in like Catholic theology at this point. So, you know, useful to know. Does come up in Ulysses as well, because of course it does. And then I'm going to read Gertrude Stein's 3 Lives, which I think, do I also have this as an audiobook? Honestly, it's been mostly about the audiobooks this month. Madame Cézanne on the cover. Cool. I've always been curious about Gertrude Stein. I've never read any of her books. I have the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas as well. Which if I like this book, I'll read it next. But this was the one I wanted to start with because it just seemed maybe a bit easier to get into, so we shall see. Anyway, those are my reading adventures in the classics for the month of April. It's been fun. It's been ridiculous. I've done a lot of walking around reading or listening to audiobooks and a lot of lying around reading. Usually with a hockey game on in the background, which I only vaguely pay attention to. Well, sometimes I pay attention. If it gets boring, then I'll just go back to my book. So yeah, that's April. I will do another video, as I said, about the other non-classic-y books I've read, because there are a few of those as well. It's just this video is getting too long. And then I'll do another wrap-up of tarot separately, as usual. So that's that for this month. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.